One of the things I find, I guess, extraordinary is if you go back to the 1990s, there appears to have been a very vigorous debate, I remember, that is, especially in the United States, of expanding NATO. It seemed like there was a lot of opposition by leading diplomats, such as yourself, recognizing that this could put us essentially, well, in another Cuban Missile Crisis, as we now see with Ukraine. However, s- slowly it seemed to go away. Not right away. In 2008, of course, when NATO promised future membership to Ukraine, you had huge opposition then as well. You had the former CIA director making the point that this would trigger war. You had Angela Merkel saying this would be seen by Moscow as a declaration of war. But why why has it become so controversial to recognize that NATO expansion, that is expansion of an anti-Russian military alliance, would provoke conflict? Because it appears that even the discourse seems to omit this thing.
Well, unfortunately, I think that the American governments from, you might say, the 1990s on uh, adopted a foreign policy which it seemed to me ideologically was similar to the Soviet policy of what they called the Brezhnev Doctrine, which was that if a country once became socialist, and I'll put that in quotes because these were countries ruled by the Communist Party, and that once they became socialist, one had to defend socialism if there was a challenge to it. And this meant that, for example, the Soviet Union intervened in Czechoslovakia and and in Hungary first, and then in Czechoslovakia, in order so-called to preserve socialism. We talked about spreading democracy. Well, first of all, we didn't define democracy very carefully. I mean, and but the idea that an outside power, particularly using economic sanctions or military force, can create a democracy in another country is simply absurd. It can't happen. Interference from the outside in internal politics is usually resisted almost everywhere at one point. And so it seems to me that that was a false doctrine, and we have called what we called a liberal world order, which was coupled with a military doctrine that said we had to dominate everything. Full spectrum dominance was part of the military doctrine, which was proclaimed during the second Bush administration. You think other countries are going to pick up with that? I mean, it just seems to me that we forget all of the sort of basic, both moral and philosophical lessons which history and also religion should have taught us. I think most religions and philosophical traditions have the equivalent of do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And yet this is precisely the principle that is now being forgotten by almost all sides in these conflicts. I would also say that the whole idea of diplomacy seems to have gone by the out. Nobody is applying it anymore. Simply force propaganda arguments, which are often based upon simply emotion, using terms that could mean almost anything, and often in the coarsest language which doesn't produce, I would say, rational thinking, but simply emotional surges. I think all of this is quite dangerous. And given the other problems we're facing in the planet, uh, the uh, the destruction of the environment, and increasingly problems uh, with, with the weather and the consequences, uh, along with the potential of that artificial intelligence can produce more and more, I say, killing machines and ways of killing and destruction. I don't see how mankind is going to survive this if these continue. It's really that serious.
Well, what is the objective, or what is being the strategy now of NATO? Because you would think, given that we stand, in front of a possible nuclear war, that they would want to put an end to this thing. But as you said before, the effort appears to be to prolong the war instead. Uh, is the objective simply to defeat Russia, or is it to use the Ukrainians as cannon fodder to simply weaken Russia? Or what is the strategy of NATO today? Is it it's very, yeah, it's a bit difficult to comprehend, because they talk about defeating Russia, but how do you defeat the world's largest nuclear power when that nuclear power perceives itself to be fighting for its existence?
Well, it's very hard to predict these things. And I know many people think that, well, Vladimir Putin is losing power and could be removed. Who knows? Maybe so, although people have been predicting that for 10 years now. And it seems to me that in many ways he has restrained forces in Russia which are more dangerous. He is under pressure from factions to use nuclear weapons and to use them against those West Europeans who are supplying them, and in fact daring them. I mean, if they hit, for example, some German or maybe a Polish facility, do you think that the U.S. or France or Germany is going to risk them by using nuclear weapons? I mean, I don't think people are really facing that. When you hear people like, some of the EU leaders who are unelected and often represent some of the smallest countries in Europe acting in such a belligerent way. I would also point out that too many people think of Russia as, the Soviet Union was not Russia. It was a communist-ruled country which actually preserved the languages and of its minorities, even promoted them as long as they followed the party line. So it was not a matter of Russia trying to wipe out these nationalities. But now, of course, when it was Russia who led the breakup of the Soviet Union, that occurred not because of Western pressure, but because of internal process. And Boris Yeltsin, who was the elected leader of the Russian Federation, led the breakup of the Soviet Union. So the idea that the Russians were always the bad guys, I mean, Yeltsin was on the side of the Baltic countries. When there was violence there, he ordered Russians not to interfere. And now, people are saying, oh, the Russians are always the bad guys. They're the imperialists. Well, yes, they were imperialists. So were the rest of us. And this thing, I would also say that this matter of the sanctions is totally one-sided. Who sanctioned the United States when we invaded Iraq and occupied it without any threat to the United States? Of course, they couldn't. And the United States has derived considerable advantages for maintaining sort of a world payment system and so on. To use that and deprive the Russians of it when we had urged them to throw off communism and have a market economy. They did it with great, I would say, damage in many ways. The 90s were a terrible time for them. It wasn't democratic. And yet now that they have entered the world economy, and after Putin became president, paid off all their debts after having been bankrupt, now they're subject to suffocating sanctions, except they're not suffocating them. I just simply do not understand. All I can say is we have a generation of leaders who did not experience the Cold War and seem not to have understood the lessons that we should have learned at that time.